All right, guys. So we're going to take a quick look today at anti-Semitism and more specifically the history of it. The idea here being that next week we're going to go in depth into the Holocaust, and it would really be an injustice if we just jumped into it without a full and accurate understanding, as best we can in this course, as to where anti-Semitism came from. The reality is that Jews, especially in Europe, had been the victim of bigotry and hatred well before the Nazis ever came on the scene. In fact, they had been the targets of this bigotry for well over 1,000 years. We're going to go back today all the way to ancient times and talk about the roots and origins of much of that anti-Semitism. Case in point here, this is a political cartoon in America from 1896, showcasing a lot of the racial stereotypes that we're going to explore today in class. I'm going to do it in the best taste I can. A lot of these things are going to sound crude and coarse, but it's very important to kind of explore where these rumors came from and dispel a lot of the misinformation that has been perpetrated by bigots and racists throughout the past couple centuries. So one thing I'll encourage you to do, I'm going to share this video with you, share the slideshow, is I'd like you to open it up and just take a look at this video. This is an example of what's happening in Israel, not today, but yesterday, actually. They celebrate this holiday each year. The date rotates. So this was April 28, 2014. If you get a chance, please open this up and check out this video. It's a pretty powerful experience that the Jewish people here take part in each year. And we'll talk about why it's so important that they continue to do it. So one of the things I wanted you to do in class is think about where rumors come from. You're all high schoolers, and more importantly, how they spread and how difficult they are to rein back in once they're said, because you're going to see a lot of the things we discussed today have a lot to do with the power of rumors. All right, so just to clarify again, anti-Semitism is a specific type of bigotry leveled at Jews. And the interesting thing about Jewish people is that all the way back to their origins, they were set apart from the people around them. As opposed to in ancient times, the other polytheistic religions in and around the Roman Empire, they were the only, and then eventually one of the only monotheistic religions in the region. So it's interesting, during the Roman Empire period, you'll hear a lot of documentation where emperors and governments label the Jews as stubborn and hostile because they refused to convert to the Roman polytheistic faiths and refused to take part in certain government-mandated programs because it violated their religion. So to me, that just reads that the people are very prideful. And yeah, I'll say stubborn. I don't think it's a bad thing. But moving forward, as the Romans increased pressure on them to give up some of those practices and eventually convert, victims like Jesus were actually killed in 30 AD. And regardless of your religious bent, the historical figure, the man Jesus, the documents would suggest was killed around the year 30 AD. And 40 years after that, the Jews began what was called the Diaspora. And if you could star this word, it's so important. It basically explains why Jewish people and where Jewish people went for about a 500-year period where they left the Middle East and moved into other parts of Asia Minor, Africa, and Europe to escape a lot of the persecution that they had been dealing with. So it literally means, or roughly means, to be scattered. Okay, here's another map that showcases it. And next week, we'll actually look at this interesting map, which showcases what I call the reverse diaspora, which was basically when Jews fled from Europe, because of course the Europeans had abandoned them during the Holocaust and allowed 7 million plus of them to die, and returned back to Israel, and many returned to, moved to the Americas. So the other thing I want you to consider when you look at these maps, imagine the fact that when the Jews leave Israel and head to these regions, they end up there as the pure minority. They speak different religions, they practice different religious festivals and holidays. They look different, they talk different. All of those things set them apart. And it's really worth mentioning, I know I've mentioned it before, but Judaism is different from other monotheistic faiths because it's not only a religious faith and practice, but it can also be a race. Okay, so in other words, if you cut open my blood, you'd never be able to tell I was a Christian. But certain people who have Jewish ancestors, you could trace their blood back to Israel. Okay, so looking through the different eras that we'll discuss, we already talked about the Roman Empire period. Towards the down end of the Roman Empire, when Emperor Constantine converted the people to Christianity, Jews still refused to convert and took a lot of flack for that. During the Middle Ages, this is one of the most fascinating misinformation events in history. Christians looked at Jews celebrating Passover, which commemorates the fact that the angel of death, according to their faith, passed over the Jewish people by looking and seeing the lamb's blood that the Jews had spread over the top of their doorsteps. And instead of going to the Jews' houses, they would go to the Egyptians' houses and kill the eldest son. This was in an effort for God to save the Jews from slavery in Egypt. But many Jews continued this practice in commemoration in Europe and would smear sometimes lamb's blood, sometimes red paint over the door of their homes. And there became a campaign against the Jews in one community where a young boy went missing, and the rumor was spread that the Jews had caught, sacrificed, and then used the blood of the child to smear over their doors in their ceremony, and then also to be put into their bread, their unleavened bread for their feast. This, of course, was later proven to be altogether false, but the rumor persisted and allowed for a lot of bigotry and racism to be carried out against the Jewish people. And then, of course, beyond that, there's the misreading of the gospel, where not recently the Catholic Church has done as best it can, or it has made a considerable effort to do away with this rumor, but basically the misinformation here that the Jews are responsible for the death of Jesus. So throughout the quote-unquote Age of Reason, the Renaissance and the Reformation, Jews in places like Italy and Germany were forced to wear separate badges, forced into ghettos. In other words, all of the things that we'll learn about next week in the 1935 Nuremberg laws was happening in Europe 500 years before the Nazis ever even came into power. So the other thing that's interesting is that during this period, in terms of finances, Jews were the only faith in Europe that were allowed to lend money. And unfortunately, this has led to one of the most popular myths and examples of prejudice against Jews. Since they were the only group religiously allowed to lend money in Europe, they were also the only group allowed to collect interest, which led a lot of especially poor people in Europe to mislabel them as money grubbers or greedy, or all of these terrible things that I hear high school kids refer to every so often, and it just makes me cringe, because if it weren't for the Jews that were lending this money, it would have been difficult for Europe to get out of the Middle Ages at all. Their loans allowed for infrastructure, new governments to form, and all sorts of other important private business ventures. Okay, during the Enlightenment, ironically, a lot of racial scientists used pseudoscience, that's Pseudo, if you'd write that down in the margins, to explain why Jews were ethnically different from other groups and therefore were inferior. And of course, we've talked about Woodrow Wilson doing that with African Americans, and we'll talk about that next week with the Nazis and how they tapped into this 2-century-old attitude about the ethnic inferiority of Jews and exploited it to really give an excuse to some of the campaigns that they used against Jews. All right, so the word itself, anti-Semitism, didn't exist until about 1873, and that's important to write down. Or I would just write down the word didn't exist until 1873. I realize this isn't in your notes, but I think it's very important. And this is where the root of Jews being considered an alien race in Europe really began to take off. So these last two examples are things that we've discussed this year, and again, they're not in your notes, but I just want to make sure I touch on them. Russian pogroms and the Dreyfus Affair especially prove that anti-Semitism was a very powerful force in Europe, and one that the Nazis just seemed to tap into. I'm not questioning the fact that the Nazis really were anti-Semitic, but it's important that we note that this sort of stuff existed before they came on the scene. Okay, so if you just want to write down those two words, pogrom and Dreyfus Affair, just to remind yourself of how important they were. At the end of this slideshow here, I got a video. You can open it up and take a look at it. It showcases during the Nazi anti-Semitic propaganda campaign some of the terrible things that carried over from what we just talked about. Okay, so we'll tap more into this next week when we discuss the Holocaust. It's going to be a heavy subject, so approach it with some maturity, and we'll talk about it then. Thank you, guys.